Don't worry, Emily Carter said into the microphone with a bright, practiced smile. Daniel and I built this beautiful day together. The ballroom filled with applause as crystal glasses chimed against polished tables, but one name, Margaret Whitmore's, never crossed her lips. Even though every chandelier above their heads and every white rose lining the aisle had been paid for by the quiet woman sitting in the front row. Margaret Whitmore sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, her posture straight the way it had been ever since she learned to carry herself through difficult rooms without asking for sympathy. At 68 years old, she had attended dozens of weddings in her life, but this one was different. This one belonged to her son. The grand ballroom of the Lakeside Grand Hotel shimmered under warm golden lights, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was. Waiters moved between tables carrying silver trays. The string quartet near the stage played a gentle melody, and 200 guests laughed as if they were part of something joyful and uncomplicated. Margaret had made sure of that. Nearly every detail in that room existed because she had quietly written the checks that made it possible. $85,000 in total. The venue alone had cost $30,000. The catering, another $12,000. Flowers, musicians, photography, a custom cake that stood 4 tiers high near the dance floor. Margaret had paid for it all without hesitation the moment Daniel admitted he and Emily couldn't afford the wedding Emily dreamed about. A mother finds a way, she had told him gently that afternoon in her small kitchen back in Ohio, sliding her checkbook across the table while Daniel looked both relieved and embarrassed. That had been 9 months ago. Since then, Margaret had watched the planning from the sidelines, answering occasional calls from the wedding planner and approving invoices when they appeared in her mailbox. Emily had always sounded cheerful on the phone, polite, efficient, but distant in a way Margaret couldn't quite name. Now, as the applause in the ballroom slowly faded, Margaret realized she had just witnessed something subtle but unmistakable. The story of this wedding had been told out loud, and she had been edited out of it. Emily stood glowing beneath the soft lights, one hand resting on Daniel's arm while guests dabbed their eyes and smiled at the romantic speech. Daniel laughed when she finished, pulling her into a brief hug as people clapped again. From across the room, it looked perfect. Margaret allowed herself a small smile as well, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She wasn't waiting for gratitude. She had never expected applause. But hearing Emily thank nearly everyone in the room, her parents, her childhood friends, even the wedding planner, while never once mentioning the woman who had made the entire evening possible, felt less like an oversight and more like something carefully arranged. Margaret reached for the glass of water beside her plate and took a small sip, letting the coolness settle her thoughts. For a moment, she simply watched the couple at the center of the dance floor, their faces glowing under the lights. Daniel looked happy, truly happy, and Margaret loved him enough not to interrupt that moment with questions. Around her, conversations restarted. Guests complimented the speech. Someone at the next table whispered about how stunning the venue looked tonight. Margaret listened quietly, her gaze drifting toward the high ceiling where the chandeliers sparkled like frozen stars. She had paid for those too, technically speaking. The rental fee had been included in the venue contract. Funny how numbers and signatures could shape an entire evening, and yet remain invisible once the music started. Margaret set her glass back down and folded her hands again. The night was still young. There would be dancing, laughter, photographs, and toasts. Plenty of time for stories to be told about love and new beginnings. But as she sat there watching her son celebrate the start of his new life, Margaret Whitmore understood something with sudden, crystal clarity. Emily Carter hadn't simply forgotten to thank her. Emily had rewritten the story so Margaret had never been part of it at all. The applause slowly faded into the soft hum of conversations as the band began to play a slower melody, the kind meant to guide guests gently toward the dance floor. Margaret Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer, watching the movement in the room as people rose from their chairs and began drifting toward Daniel and Emily. Cameras flashed. Laughter echoed against the tall windows overlooking the lake. To everyone else, it looked like the beginning of a perfect celebration. Margaret stood carefully, smoothing the front of her navy blue dress, the same dress she had chosen weeks earlier after. Daniel told her the wedding colors would be ivory and deep blue. She had wanted to match the evening without drawing attention to herself. That had always been her way. As she stepped toward the edge of the ballroom floor, she noticed the way guests approached Emily first. They hugged her. They congratulated her. They praised the ceremony, the flowers, the elegance of the evening. Emily smiled brightly at each compliment, as though she had built the entire celebration from nothing but determination and love. Daniel stayed close beside her, laughing easily, his arm often circling her shoulders. Margaret watched them from a short distance, feeling both pride and something quieter beneath it, something harder to name. She remembered Daniel as a boy standing on a chair beside her kitchen counter, trying to help stir pancake batter on Sunday mornings. He used to grin whenever he spilled flour on the floor, because he knew she would laugh instead of scold him. Back then life had been simple. After her husband passed away nearly 20 years earlier, Margaret had worked long hours at the county office, balancing paperwork and overtime shifts while making sure Daniel never felt the weight of what had been lost. She had attended every school concert, every baseball game, every parent meeting. She had told herself that sacrifices were part of motherhood. They were never something meant to be counted out loud. Now the ballroom lights reflected across the polished floor as the first slow dance began. The band played a gentle arrangement while Daniel guided Emily into the center of the room. Guests gathered in a loose circle around them, smiling as the newly married couple moved together under the soft golden glow of the chandeliers. Margaret stood near one of the tall columns at the edge of the room, her hands resting loosely together. She noticed Helen Brooks approaching from across the floor. Helen had been Margaret's closest friend for more than 30 years, the kind of friend who could read a situation without needing explanations. Helen stopped beside her and followed Margaret's gaze toward the dance floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Helen leaned slightly closer and said quietly, "That speech was something." Margaret kept her eyes on the dancers. "It was beautiful," she replied calmly. Helen tilted her head, studying Margaret's expression. "Beautiful, yes. But interesting." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "Interesting how?" Helen hesitated for a second before answering. She thanked nearly everyone in this room. Margaret nodded slowly. "That is true." Helen lowered her voice further. "Except the woman who paid for the room we are standing in." Margaret did not react right away. The music drifted through the air, gentle and smooth, while Daniel spun Emily carefully across the floor. Guests clapped softly as the couple laughed together. Margaret finally looked toward Helen and said in the same steady tone she had used her entire life when facing uncomfortable truths, "People tell stories the way they want them remembered." Helen studied her face for another moment. "And how do you want this one remembered?" Margaret glanced back at the dance floor, watching her son smile under the bright lights. Then she answered quietly, "That depends on how the rest of the evening unfolds." The music shifted into a brighter rhythm as the band finished the slow dance, and the guests responded immediately, filling the dance floor with the relaxed excitement that usually follows the first formal moment of a wedding reception. Margaret Whitmore remained near the tall column where she had been standing, watching the movement of people with the calm attentiveness she had developed over a lifetime of observing rooms before stepping into them. Daniel and Emily were still at the center of attention, surrounded by cousins, friends, and co-workers who wanted photographs and congratulations. Every few seconds someone raised a phone, capturing smiling faces beneath the warm chandelier light. Margaret noticed how naturally Emily guided the attention. She placed a hand on Daniel's arm when someone approached. She laughed easily. She leaned slightly toward the camera whenever a photograph was taken. It was subtle, but it kept the focus exactly where Emily seemed to want it. Margaret did not judge it immediately. Some people were simply comfortable being seen. Still, as she watched the evening unfold, small memories from the past months began arranging themselves quietly in her mind, like pieces of a puzzle sliding into place. She remembered the first planning meeting at a small cafe near Daniel's apartment. Emily had spread notebooks and color samples across the table, while Margaret listened and offered to help with the larger expenses. Emily had smiled politely then too, thanking her for the generosity while explaining that she preferred to manage the creative decisions herself. At the time, Margaret had admired the confidence. It had seemed practical for the bride to shape the celebration. But now other details returned to her with sharper clarity. There had been the seating chart Emily adjusted several times without explanation. There had been the guest list that somehow excluded several of Daniel's childhood friends, while adding colleagues Margaret had never met. And there had been the moment 3 weeks earlier when the wedding planner called Margaret directly to confirm a payment. During that call, the planner had said something unusual. She had laughed lightly and mentioned that Emily had requested the speeches remain focused on the couple's journey so that the evening would feel more personal. Margaret had not thought much about it then. It sounded like an innocent preference. But standing in the ballroom now, hearing guests repeat how touching Emily's speech had been, Margaret felt a quiet understanding settle into place. The absence of her name had not been spontaneous. It had been planned long before the guests ever arrived. Helen Brooks shifted beside her and crossed her arms thoughtfully while watching the dance floor. "You know," Helen said after a moment, "I have attended a lot of weddings in my life, but I have never seen a bride control the spotlight quite like that." Margaret glanced toward her friend, then back at the center of the room where Emily was now laughing with a group of bridesmaids. "She certainly knows what she wants," Margaret replied calmly. Helen gave a soft hum of agreement. "And she knows how to get it." The band began another lively song, and several guests pulled Daniel toward the dance floor again. Emily followed, her white dress catching the light with every step. Margaret noticed that Daniel looked completely at ease, smiling the same way he used to smile when he believed everything in the world was exactly as it appeared. Watching him like that softened something inside her, but it also strengthened another thought forming quietly beneath the surface. Margaret Whitmore had spent decades learning how to read situations that were not spoken out loud. Tonight she realized she was not simply watching a wedding reception. She was watching the beginning of a story someone else had already tried to rewrite. Margaret Whitmore slowly stepped away from the column and moved toward the edge of the ballroom where the long buffet table shimmered under rows of soft lights. Guests were gathering there now, laughing as servers arranged plates and poured glasses of sparkling cider and wine. The scent of roasted chicken, buttered vegetables, and fresh bread filled the air, blending with the distant rhythm of the band. Margaret picked up a glass of water instead, her movements calm and deliberate. She had always believed that the quiet moments at events revealed more than the speeches or photographs. People relaxed once the formal parts were finished. They spoke more freely, and sometimes they forgot who might be listening nearby. Across the room, Daniel was dancing with one of Emily's cousins while Emily stood surrounded by bridesmaids who admired the delicate embroidery on her dress. Margaret watched them for a moment before turning slightly as two guests approached the buffet table beside her. They were younger women Margaret vaguely recognized from the rehearsal dinner the night before. One of them lowered her voice as she reached for a plate. "This wedding is incredible," she said. Emily really pulled it off. The other nodded quickly. "Seriously, I heard they kept the budget under control too. That is impressive for a place like this." Margaret remained still, her fingers resting lightly on the stem of her glass as she listened without turning around. The first woman laughed softly. "Well, Emily told everyone she and Daniel handled most of it themselves. That is kind of amazing if you think about it." Margaret did not react outwardly, but the words settled carefully into her thoughts. She took a slow sip of water and looked toward the lake visible through the tall windows lining the far wall. The evening sky outside had turned a deep shade of blue, the last light of sunset fading into the horizon. Inside the ballroom, however, the celebration continued as if the night were just beginning. Helen Brooks soon joined her again, carrying a small plate of food she had clearly forgotten to eat. Helen followed Margaret's gaze toward the dance floor and then spoke quietly. "You hear that conversation too?" Margaret gave a small nod. "Yes." Helen sighed gently. "It sounds like Emily has been telling a slightly different version of how this wedding happened." Margaret placed her glass back onto the table and folded her hands together once more. "People often simplify stories when they tell them," she said evenly. Helen raised an eyebrow. That sounded less like simplifying and more like rewriting. Margaret allowed a faint smile to appear, though it was thoughtful rather than amused. "Perhaps." The band shifted again, beginning a lively song that drew even more guests toward the dance floor. Daniel appeared happier with each passing minute, greeting friends, clapping along with the music, occasionally glancing proudly at his bride. Margaret watched him carefully. He did not seem aware of the quiet narrative forming around him. In his mind, tonight was probably exactly what it looked like: a beautiful celebration, a loving bride, a room full of supportive family and friends. Margaret felt a gentle ache in her chest at the thought, but it was not anger. It was something calmer, something clearer. She had learned long ago that truth had a way of revealing itself without needing to be forced. Sometimes all it required was patience and careful attention. Margaret Whitmore lifted her gaze once more to the chandeliers glowing above the ballroom floor. The wedding celebration continued beneath their warm light, full of laughter and music. Yet for Margaret, the evening had quietly changed. She was no longer simply attending her son's wedding. She was beginning to understand the story unfolding around her, and more importantly, she was beginning to see exactly where her place in that story had been deliberately erased. Margaret Whitmore stepped away from the buffet table and walked slowly toward the tall windows overlooking the dark lake outside the hotel. The music behind her grew louder as more guests joined the dance floor, the steady rhythm of laughter and conversation filling the ballroom with warmth. From the outside, the evening still looked flawless. White tablecloths glowed under soft lights. Crystal glasses reflected tiny sparks across the room. The wedding planner moved smoothly between tables, checking that every guest felt attended to. Margaret paused near the window and looked at the reflection staring back at her in the glass. A composed woman in her late 60s, dressed simply, standing alone while the celebration continued around her. For a moment, she remembered another evening many years ago when Daniel had been 8 years old and insisted on dancing with her in their living room after dinner. The old radio had been playing a country song, and Daniel had stepped on her feet at least 3 times before bursting into laughter. Back then his world had been small enough to fit inside their little house in Ohio. Margaret had promised herself she would always give him the stability she never had growing up. That promise had shaped every decision she made afterward. She worked late shifts when the county office needed extra help. She saved every tax refund instead of spending it. She quietly set aside money for Daniel's college fund long before he ever mentioned wanting to attend Ohio State University. Years passed quickly after that. Daniel graduated. He moved to Chicago for his first job. Then one spring afternoon, he called to say he had met someone special. Emily Carter. Margaret remembered the excitement in his voice that day. She had listened carefully while he described Emily's ambition, her confidence, the way she seemed to know exactly what she wanted from life. Margaret had been happy for him, truly happy. When Daniel introduced Emily during a family dinner several months later, Margaret noticed how polished she seemed, how easily she directed conversations and filled quiet spaces with confident stories about her career in marketing. Emily had shaken Margaret's hand with a warm smile and thanked her for raising such a wonderful son. At the time, Margaret believed every word. The memory faded as the ballroom lights reflected softly across the window. Margaret watched guests crossing the room behind her reflection, carrying drinks, sharing jokes, congratulating the newly married couple again and again. A moment later, Helen Brooks joined her by the window, placing her untouched plate on the narrow ledge nearby. "You are doing that thing again," Helen said gently. Margaret turned slightly. "What thing?" Helen folded her arms and leaned lightly against the wall. "The quiet thinking face. The one you used to make when Daniel forgot to tell you something important back in high school." Margaret allowed herself a small breath of amusement. He usually forgot to mention his report cards until the last possible moment. Helen smiled faintly. Then her expression grew thoughtful again. "This situation feels similar somehow." Margaret looked across the ballroom toward the dance floor where Emily was now greeting another group of guests with the same polished ease she had displayed all evening. Daniel stood nearby, smiling proudly as if everything around him had unfolded naturally. Margaret studied the scene carefully. "It is not the same," she said softly. Helen raised an eyebrow. "No." Margaret shook her head once. "When Daniel hit a report card, it meant he was afraid of disappointing me." She paused, watching Emily laugh while accepting another compliment from a guest. "Tonight feels different." Helen waited. Margaret finally spoke again, her voice calm and steady. "Tonight someone else is deciding which parts of the story deserve to be remembered." Margaret Whitmore remained by the window for another minute, watching the quiet reflection of the ballroom lights shimmer across the dark surface of the lake. Behind her, the celebration continued to grow louder as the band shifted into a faster song, and clusters of guests gathered closer to the dance floor. Laughter echoed across the room, mixing with the soft clink of glasses and the steady rhythm of music. Margaret turned slowly and began walking back through the crowd, moving with the same calm composure she carried everywhere. Years of attending community events, office gatherings, and school ceremonies had taught her how to move through busy rooms without drawing attention to herself. As she passed one of the round tables near the center of the ballroom, she noticed Daniel standing beside a group of co-workers who were congratulating him enthusiastically. One of the men raised a glass and said something that made Daniel laugh, the relaxed laugh Margaret remembered from his younger years. Emily stood nearby as well, listening with a polite smile while someone complimented the elegance of the reception. Margaret slowed her steps when she heard Emily respond. Daniel worked incredibly hard to make tonight happen, Emily said with an easy confidence. We wanted something meaningful but still simple. The co-workers nodded with admiration, clearly impressed. One of them added, You both did an amazing job pulling this off. Emily gave a gracious smile and thanked them, her tone warm and practiced. Daniel wrapped an arm around her shoulders, looking proud and slightly overwhelmed by the praise. Margaret stood quietly near a nearby table, her hands resting lightly on the back of a chair as she listened. None of the comments were cruel. None of them were openly dishonest. Yet something in the conversation felt carefully incomplete. The room around her continued buzzing with celebration while Margaret allowed the details to settle in her thoughts. Earlier that afternoon, she had seen the final invoice from the wedding planner before leaving her hotel room. The number had been clear and precise, printed neatly at the bottom of the document. $85,340. Every payment had passed through Margaret's account. Every deposit had been approved with her signature. She had never mentioned the amount to Daniel because she did not believe generosity required an announcement. But standing there now, hearing Emily describe the event as something she and Daniel had simply arranged through their own effort, Margaret realized the difference between gratitude and silence. Silence left space for other versions of the truth to grow. Helen Brooks appeared beside her again, holding 2 glasses of sparkling water and handing one to Margaret. You look like you are solving a puzzle, Helen said quietly. Margaret accepted the glass and gave a thoughtful nod. Perhaps I am. Helen glanced toward Daniel and Emily across the room. The story they are telling tonight is becoming clearer. Margaret followed her gaze, watching Emily greet another pair of guests while Daniel nodded along happily. For a moment Margaret remembered the stack of envelopes she had mailed months ago, each containing a carefully written check to cover another piece of the wedding Emily envisioned. She had never imagined those small acts of support would eventually disappear from the narrative altogether. Margaret took a small sip of water and looked calmly at her friend. Stories change depending on who tells them, she said softly. Helen tilted her head. And what are you going to do about that? Margaret's eyes moved once more toward the center of the ballroom, where her son stood smiling beneath the warm lights. Her voice remained gentle but certain when she answered. For now, I am going to keep listening. Margaret Whitmore continued to stand near the center of the ballroom while the celebration carried on around her, the music growing louder as more guests joined the dance floor. The band had moved into a lively rhythm now, the kind that encouraged people to clap along and forget about the formal parts of the evening. Glasses lifted in cheerful toasts. Waiters passed through the crowd with trays of desserts. From the outside, everything about the reception appeared effortless and joyful. Margaret noticed how naturally the room seemed to orbit around Emily. Wherever Emily moved, attention followed. Guests leaned in to hear her stories. Bridesmaids laughed at her jokes. Even the wedding photographer seemed to adjust his position constantly to keep Emily in the center of the frame. Daniel remained beside her most of the time, smiling proudly as if he believed the evening had unfolded exactly the way it was meant to. Margaret watched him for a moment, remembering another celebration many years earlier when Daniel graduated from college. That day he had walked across the stage at Ohio State University wearing a simple black cap and gown while Margaret sat in the audience holding back tears of pride. After the ceremony, Daniel had found her in the crowd and wrapped her in a hug, so tight she could barely breathe. We did it, Mom, he had said then. Not I did it. We did it. The memory stayed with Margaret as she slowly moved toward one of the smaller tables near the dance floor. She sat down quietly, placing her glass of water beside a folded napkin while the music carried through the room. Across the ballroom, Emily was speaking animatedly with another group of guests, explaining something with lively gestures while Daniel nodded beside her. Margaret could not hear the conversation clearly over the music, but she noticed the way Emily occasionally glanced toward the decorations, the tables, the cake display, as if presenting the evening as a carefully arranged accomplishment. Helen Brooks soon joined Margaret at the table, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a thoughtful expression. "You know," Helen said quietly, "I keep hearing the same thing from people tonight." Margaret looked at her friend calmly. "And what is that?" Helen folded her hands on the table. "Everyone keeps saying how impressive it is that Emily managed to organize such an elegant wedding." Margaret listened without interrupting. Helen continued in a softer tone. "It is almost as if the entire evening appeared out of thin air." Margaret's eyes drifted briefly toward the far side of the ballroom, where the towering wedding cake stood beneath a small spotlight. She remembered the afternoon she approved that order with the bakery. 300 servings. Custom ivory frosting. Handcrafted sugar flowers to match the centerpieces. Margaret had chosen the design carefully because Emily said she wanted something timeless. Margaret finally looked back at Helen and spoke gently. "People believe the version of a story they hear the most often." Helen studied her face for a moment. "And tonight Emily is telling that version very confidently." Margaret gave a small nod. Across the room, Daniel lifted a glass during another round of cheers, his expression relaxed and proud. Margaret felt a quiet warmth seeing him happy, yet beneath that warmth another thought had begun to settle into place. For most of her life, Margaret Whitmore had believed that kindness spoke for itself, that generosity did not need witnesses. But sitting there in the middle of a celebration she had quietly made possible, Margaret began to realize something important. Silence did not always protect the truth. Sometimes it simply made it easier for someone else to replace it. The music softened again as the band transitioned into a slower song, and the lights above the ballroom dimmed slightly, casting a warmer glow across the tables and the polished wooden floor. Couples began drifting back toward the center of the room, while others remained seated, enjoying dessert and quiet conversations. Margaret Whitmore remained at the small round table where she and Helen had been sitting, her hands folded calmly in front of her while she watched the celebration continue. The towering wedding cake had just been sliced, and guests now carried delicate plates topped with layers of vanilla sponge and buttercream frosting. Waiters moved gracefully through the crowd refilling glasses. Everything about the evening still looked perfect. Across the ballroom, Daniel stood beside Emily near the cake table, laughing as one of the bridesmaids accidentally dropped a fork and quickly bent down to retrieve it. Emily leaned toward Daniel and said something that made him smile even wider. Margaret noticed how easily the two of them moved through the room together, greeting guests, posing for photographs, accepting compliments as if they had rehearsed the rhythm of the evening long before it began. Helen Brooks rested her elbow lightly on the table and studied Margaret's quiet expression. "You are very calm about all of this," Helen said after a moment. Margaret glanced toward her friend. "Should I not be?" Helen hesitated before answering. "Most people would probably feel upset if they heard their role in an event disappear the way yours has tonight." Margaret considered the thought carefully while watching Daniel guide Emily gently onto the dance floor again as the slower music continued. "Upset would not change anything," she said softly. Helen tilted her head slightly. "Then what will?" Margaret did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched the newly married couple move slowly across the floor while guests gathered around the edges of the room. The photographer circled them quietly, capturing the moment from different angles. Margaret remembered signing the contract for that photographer only 6 months earlier after Emily insisted that professional photos were the most important investment for the wedding. Margaret had agreed because memories mattered. Photographs preserved stories people wanted to remember. The thought lingered in her mind as she looked across the ballroom at the man, now documenting every smile and every graceful turn of the couple beneath the chandeliers. Margaret Whitmore suddenly realized that stories were not only told with words. They were also preserved in details, in records, in quiet documents that existed long after the music ended. She reached slowly into her purse and pulled out her phone, glancing briefly at the screen before placing it back again. Helen noticed the movement. "Thinking about something?" she asked. Margaret gave a small nod. "Just remembering a few details from the planning process." Helen's eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. "Important details?" Margaret allowed a faint, thoughtful smile to appear. Sometimes the smallest details become the most important ones later. Across the ballroom, Emily laughed again as Daniel spun her gently beneath the warm lights, and guests applauded softly while the band continued playing. The celebration had not changed. The room still felt joyful. Yet inside Margaret's mind something had quietly shifted. For the first time that evening, she was not simply observing the story being told around her. She was beginning to consider how the truth of that story might eventually find its own way back into the light. The evening slowly moved toward its final hours as the music softened once again and many of the older guests began preparing to leave the ballroom. The once crowded dance floor now held only a few couples swaying beneath the warm chandelier lights, while servers quietly cleared empty glasses and folded napkins from nearby tables. Margaret Whitmore remained seated where she had been for most of the night, her posture calm and composed as she watched the celebration gradually settle into a quieter rhythm. Across the room, Daniel stood near the entrance with Emily, thanking guests who approached them one by one before heading toward the elevators. The same compliments repeated again and again. Beautiful ceremony. Elegant reception. Such a perfect wedding. Emily accepted every word with gracious smiles while Daniel nodded proudly beside her. Margaret observed the scene with the steady patience that had guided her through most of her life. A few minutes later, Daniel spotted her across the room and lifted his hand in greeting before walking over. Emily followed beside him, her white dress brushing lightly against the floor as they approached the table. Daniel looked happy, slightly tired in the way people often look after a long day filled with excitement. "Mom," he said warmly as he reached her chair. "You are still here. I was starting to think you slipped out early." Margaret looked up at her son and returned the gentle smile he had known since childhood. "I wanted to see the evening through," she said. Emily stood beside Daniel, still glowing from the attention of the night. "We hope you enjoyed everything," she added politely. "It turned out exactly the way we imagined." Margaret nodded slowly as she glanced around the ballroom one last time. The band was packing away their instruments. The wedding cake had been reduced to a few remaining slices on a silver tray. The photographer was capturing final photos of the newly married couple beneath the arch of flowers near the entrance. "It certainly was memorable," Margaret replied calmly. Daniel leaned slightly closer, his voice softer now. "I know the planning was hectic these past months, but Emily worked incredibly hard to make all of this happen." Margaret studied his face for a moment, recognizing the sincerity in his words. He truly believed what he was saying. Emily rested a hand lightly on his arm, smiling with quiet satisfaction, as if the evening had confirmed everything she wanted others to see. Margaret Whitmore did not challenge the moment. She simply nodded once more and rose slowly from her chair. "You both created a very beautiful night," she said gently. Daniel wrapped his arms around her in a brief hug before stepping back toward Emily. As Margaret reached for her purse and prepared to leave, she allowed her gaze to drift one last time across the ballroom she had quietly built piece by piece through months of unseen support. The music had stopped now, leaving only the soft murmur of guests departing into the hallway beyond the doors. Margaret paused near the exit beside Helen Brooks, who had waited patiently for her friend. Helen glanced back at the room and then at Margaret. "Well," she said quietly, "that was quite a story tonight." Margaret looked toward Daniel and Emily standing together under the last remaining lights. Her expression remained peaceful, but there was a new certainty in her voice when she answered. "Yes," she said softly, "but the story is not finished yet."